Welcome back, traveller of midnight hours. You've walked with me through the golden morning of creation, seen gods learn their names, and giants dream their dreams. Now the sun hangs differently in the sky, still beautiful, but slanted, casting longer shadows that whisper of evening approaching, settle deeper into the darkness around you. What I'm about to tell you is the other half of the breath, the exhale that follows every inhale, the silence that gives meaning to every song. This is the story of how gods discovered they were mortal, how light learned it could die, how endings became the most beautiful beginnings of all. The Norns have been busy at their loom. The threads they weave now are darker colours, crimson and ash, silver and storm cloud grey. But they weave with the same steady rhythm because they understand what gods are only beginning to learn, that every story, no matter how glorious, must someday reach its final page. Are you ready? Then let me tell you about the children who would eat their father's world. Love, they say, makes fools of the wisest beings. Even Loki, silver-tongued shapeshifter, found himself tangled in affairs of the heart that would echo through eternity. In the wild places of Jotunheim, where the wind tastes of freedom and danger, Loki met Angerboda, the mother of monsters, though she hadn't earned that title yet. She was a giantess with eyes like winter storms and hair like shadows moving across snow. In her, Loki found someone who understood the music of chaos, who danced to rhythms that made order uncomfortable. From their union came 3 children, each more impossible than the last, each carrying in their blood the seeds of cosmic transformation. First came Fenrir. Picture a wolf pup, small enough to hold in your hands, soft as cloud shadow. But watch his eyes. Even as a cub, they held the light of stars going supernova. When he yawned, mountains felt nervous. When he stretched, earthquakes held their breath. The gods brought him to Asgard, not from kindness, but from the terrible logic of keeping your enemies close. They fed him, played with him, watched him grow, and grow, and grow, each day larger, each day stronger, until his footsteps left cracks in marble, and his howls made thunder sound like whispers. Only Tyr, god of courage and honor, dared approach him without fear. Every day, the one-handed god, though he was, still two-handed, then would bring Fenrir meat and kind words, scratching behind ears that could have sheltered houses. Second came Jormungandr, the world serpent. Born not as a snake, but as a question mark made flesh, sinuous, seeking, forever growing in the attempt to find his own tail. Odin took one look at this child and saw in him the echo of Nidugr, the dragon that gnawed at Yggdrasil's roots. In his wisdom and his fear, the Allfather cast the young serpent into the deepest ocean, but the sea welcomed Jormungandr like a long-lost son. He grew in the blue darkness, fed on leviathans and sailors' tales, until he encircled all of Midgard like a living horizon. Ships' captains would sometimes catch glimpses of him, a flash of scale larger than their vessel, an eye like a green moon rising from the depths, the suggestion of coils that went on forever. And third came Hel. Ah, Hel. Half her face was beautiful enough to make poets weep, pale as morning mist, serene as snow falling on a quiet lake. But her other half was the face of endings, blue-black as frostbite, showing the skull beneath the skin. She was death, that had learned to be patient, decay, that had developed a sense of humor. Odin looked at her and saw necessity. Someone had to rule the dead who died not in battle, but in their beds. The children who never grew up, the old who faded like autumn leaves, the sick who couldn't lift swords. so he gave her dominion over Helheim, a realm of cold stone and quiet dignity, where endings learn to be comfortable with themselves. 3 children. 3 destinies. 3 keys to the lock that held the world together. The gods told themselves they were being wise, separating these forces, containing them. They didn't understand that some things grow more dangerous when you try to cage them. They didn't realize that every chain they forged was also forging the god who would break it. Chapter 2. The Binding of Fenrir. Fenrir grew, not just in size, wolves do that, but in presence, in significance, in the terrible weight of what he represented. When he walked through Asgard's halls, conversation stopped. When he lay down to sleep, gods found excuses to be elsewhere. When he played, mountains decided to take the day off from being stable. The gods held council. What do you do with a weapon that thinks it's your friend? Let us test his strength, they said, making it sound like a game. They brought chains, iron links thick as tree trunks forged in the deep fires of Svartalfheim. Try to break free, Fenrir. Show us how strong you've grown. Fenrir stretched, yawned, and snapped the chains like spiderwebs. The gods applauded, but their smiles were carved from ice. They brought stronger chains, dromy, twice as thick, blessed with binding runes. Again, Fenrir shrugged free, wagging his tail as if this were the most delightful game he'd ever played. Then the gods grew desperate, and desperate gods make deals with dwarfs. The sons of Ivaldi worked for months in their deep forges, but they weren't working with metal. They were working with impossibility itself, weaving a chain from things that didn't exist. The sound of a cat's footfall. Have you ever heard a cat walking? Neither had anyone else. The breath of a fish. Fish don't breathe air, so this was silence given weight. The beard of a woman. In the old days, this meant something that should exist but doesn't. The roots of a mountain. Mountains don't have roots, just the illusion of them. The sinews of a bear. Not from any real bear, but from the idea of bear strength. The spittle of a bird, which is to say, the essence of something too proud to drool. When they finished, they held Gleipnir, a ribbon that looked like silk, but felt like destiny, smooth as water, soft as sighs, and absolutely unbreakable by any force in any of the 9 realms. Fenrir looked at it and knew. Perhaps he smelled the magic on it. Perhaps he saw the trap in the god's eyes. Perhaps he simply understood that all friendships eventually reveal their true nature. "I'll let you bind me with this," he said, his voice still carrying the rumble of distant avalanches. "But one of you must place his hand in my mouth as pledge of good faith." The gods looked at each other. The gods looked at their hands. The gods looked anywhere but at Fenrir's eyes, all except Tyr. Tyr, who had fed him as a pup. Tyr, who had played with him, scratched behind his ears, treated him like family, rather than a weapon waiting to go off. Tyr stepped forward and placed his right hand between jaws that could crunch through mountains. They bound Fenrir with Gleipnir. The ribbon held, would always hold, woven as it was, from the spaces between things, from the silence where sound should be. And when Fenrir realized he was truly trapped, truly betrayed by those who had called themselves his friends, he closed his jaws. Tyr's hand fell to the ground like an autumn leaf. From that day forward, he would be called the one-handed god. But he never complained, never showed regret. He had paid the price for the god's safety with his flesh, and he considered it a fair bargain. Fenrir was taken to a desert island where he could rage without harming anyone. But his howls, his howls of betrayal and longing and terrible patience. Those echoed across all the 9 realms, and every wolf that ever lived learned that song of abandonment. The gods told themselves they had done what was necessary. They didn't understand that every injustice creates its own justice, every betrayal its own revenge. They had planted the seed of Ragnarök in the heart of the one being who might have loved them enough to fight against it. Chapter 3. The Light That Went Out. But the darkness didn't come from Fenrir, chained though he was. It didn't come from Ginnungagap, coiled in the deep seas. It didn't come from Hel, ruling her cold realm with patient kindness. The darkness came from light itself, learning it could die. Baldr. How do you describe sunlight given form? How do you explain the way morning feels when it first touches your face? Baldr was what would happen if joy decided to become a person, if laughter learned to walk upright, if the first day of spring took human shape and married wisdom. He was Odin's son, but where the Allfather was complex as storms, Baldr was simple as starlight, pure, kind, the sort of person who made you remember why you believed good things were possible. When he smiled, flowers bloomed out of season. When he laughed, even the frost giants paused in their plotting to remember what happiness sounded like. But Baldr began to dream. Dark dreams, dreams of shadows with teeth, of silence that ate sound, of cold that consumed warmth. He woke each morning with the taste of endings in his mouth, with visions of a world without light burned behind his eyelids. Frigg, his mother, felt each nightmare as if it were her own. She who wove the clouds and knew the language of growing things, who had held him as a baby bright enough to illuminate the hall without candles. She could not bear the thought of losing him. So Frigg went walking to every corner of creation, speaking to everything that had ever been born or made or dreamed into existence, to the iron in the mountains, asking it never to harm her son, to the fire in the hearths, begging it never to burn him, to the water in the wells, pleading with it never to drown him, to every beast, every bird, every growing thing. "Promise me," she whispered, "promise me you will never hurt my beautiful boy." And they promised. Iron swore by its strength, fire swore by its passion, water swore by its persistence, the beasts swore by their wildness, the birds by their freedom, the plants by their patience. All except mistletoe. Such a small thing, such a gentle thing, a plant that grew not in earth but on the sides of oak trees, drawing its life from other lives, existing in the spaces between earth and air. So harmless, so fragile, that Frigg looked at it and thought, this tender thing could never hurt anyone, and passed it by. But Loki was listening. Loki, who was already walking the thin edge between God and not God, between friend and enemy. Loki, whose nature was to find the crack in every certainty, the weakness in every strength. He heard what Frigg didn't ask for. He noticed what she overlooked, and in his shape-shifting way, he filed the information away like a key to a lock he might someday need to open. Chapter 4. The Game of Invulnerability. The gods discovered Baldr's invulnerability, and being gods, they turned it into entertainment. Picture the scene. The great hall of Asgard filled with laughter and the ringing of metal on metal. Gods taking turns hurling spears at Baldr, shooting arrows at his chest, swinging swords at his neck. And everything, turning aside, bending away, refusing to harm him. Thor threw stones that crumbled to dust before they touched him. Vidar shot arrows that turned to flowers mid-flight. Freya challenged him to single combat, and found his blade would not so much as scratch Baldr's skin. They made it into a celebration. The festival of Baldr's blessing, they might have called it. Proof that good things could be protected, that innocence had its own armor, that some lights were too bright to be extinguished. And in the corner, unnoticed, an old woman sat watching. She had grey hair and knowing eyes and the sort of smile that might have been kind if you didn't look too closely. She asked questions in the soft voice of grandmothers everywhere. "How wonderful this is. Tell me, has your dear Queen Frigg truly gained promises from everything in creation?" "Oh yes," the gods replied proudly, barely glancing at her. "Everything has sworn never to harm him." "Everything," the old woman pressed gently. "Even the smallest things, even the weakest." Well, and here they laughed, because it was such a silly concern. There was mistletoe, but that gentle thing could hardly harm anyone. The old woman nodded and smiled and faded away like mist at sunrise. But she returned, not as an old woman this time, but as Loki in his true shape, carrying in his hands a dart, carved from mistletoe. Such a small thing, such a fragile-looking weapon. It felt like holding crystallized sadness. Herder stood apart from the games, Baldr's brother blind from birth, listening to the laughter he couldn't fully join. He heard the joy in the voices, the celebration of his brother's blessing, and felt the familiar weight of being the one who couldn't participate. "Come," Loki whispered beside him, placing the mistletoe dart in his hands. "Let me guide your aim. You should be part of this celebration too." And Herder, grateful for the kindness, grateful to be included, let Loki position his hands, let him aim the dart at the sound of his brother's laughter. The mistletoe flew. The hall fell silent, as if sound itself had died. The dart, too gentle to be called a weapon, too small to be taken seriously, pierced Baldr's chest and found his heart. Light went out of the world. Baldr fell like a star falling from heaven, and where he struck the ground, the very earth wept. His light dimmed, flickered, and went dark for the first time since his birth. The god of joy learned what sorrow felt like. The god of summer discovered winter. The god of tomorrow met today's end. The silence stretched like a held breath. Then Frigg's scream shattered it. Not a sound of grief, but of a universe discovering it was breakable. Odin wept, and his tears became storms. Thor's hammer fell from nerveless fingers. Freya's golden tears turned ice before they hit the ground. And Herder stood there, blind hands still extended, not understanding what he had done, not comprehending why the laughter had stopped, why the world felt suddenly cold. Chapter 5. The Journey to Hell. The gods would not accept this ending, could not, would not let the light go gentle into that dark realm. Hermodr, Baldr's brother, volunteered for the journey no god wanted to make. He mounted Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged steed, and rode hard toward Helheim. 9 days and 9 nights through valleys that grew progressively colder, across bridges that spanned rivers of tears, past trees that grew downward into darker soil. At the gates of Hell's realm, he found his brother sitting in the place of honor, at Hell's table, pale as moonlight, but still beautiful, still radiating the gentle warmth that made him beloved. Even in death, Baldr was purely, impossibly himself. Hermodr knelt before Hel, half-living goddess, half-corpse queen, who ruled with the impartiality of winter and the patience of stones. "Please," he begged, "all the gods, all the worlds mourn for Baldr. Let him return. The light has gone out of creation. Hel considered this with her living eye, while her dead eye saw deeper truths. If all things truly mourn for him, she said in a voice like wind through empty halls, if everything in creation weeps for his loss, then he may return. But if even one thing refuses to grieve, here he must remain. Hermodr rode back with this message, and the gods scattered across all the 9 realms, begging everything that existed to weep for Baldr. And everything did. The mountains wept rivers of snowmelt. The seas wept foam and spray. The trees wept amber tears that hardened in the sunlight. The stones wept moss and lichen. The very air wept rain that fell for days without stopping. Fire wept, steam, iron wept rust. The dead in their graves wept earth tears. The living wept salt tears that tasted of endings and longing. All the worlds became one vast lamentation, and the gods thought surely this would be enough. Surely the universe's grief would resurrect its most beloved son. But in a cave in the wilderness, they found one giantess who sat dry-eyed and unmoved. Thuk, she called herself, thanks, though her gratitude was bitter as winter berries. Let Hel keep what is hers, she said when they begged her to weep. Baldr's death never brought me joy, but neither did his life. I will not weep for him. And some say that when she spoke, her voice carried the cadence of lies told by silver tongues. Some say that in the darkness of the cave, her eyes gleamed with the cruel intelligence of one who enjoyed watching gods discover their limitations. Some say Thok was Loki in disguise, ensuring that his crime could never be undone. So Baldr remained in Helheim, and the first age of the gods was over. Chapter 6. The Binding of Loki. After Baldr's death, something changed in the halls of Asgard. Laughter came harder. Joy felt like betrayal. The gods looked at each other and wondered who would be next to reveal a hidden fang. And they looked at Loki with new eyes. Loki, who had always danced on the edge between helpful and harmful. Loki, who had saved them as often as he'd endangered them. Loki, whose silver tongue had talked them out of so many disasters that they'd forgotten to count how many he'd created. But now they remembered. Now they added up the cost of his chaos. Now they saw the pattern in his random-seeming mischief. The final straw came at a feast, because endings often come disguised as ordinary moments. The gods had gathered to honor Aegir, the sea giant, in his underwater hall. Even in their grief, they tried to maintain the rituals that held their world together. Loki arrived uninvited, as was his way, but instead of his usual playful insults, his usual half-serious provocations, he brought poison, not in a cup, but in his words. He recited every secret shame, every hidden sin, every moment of weakness or cowardice that the gods thought they'd buried. You, he said to Odin, broke oath after oath when it served your purposes. You, he said to Frigg, knew of your husband's infidelities and pretended not to see. You, he said to Thor, for all your strength, let innocence die while you were away playing hero. One by one, he stripped away their pretenses, their comfortable lies about themselves. He held up a mirror that showed not their faces, but their failures. But here's the thing about Loki's truth-telling. He wasn't wrong. That was what made it so cruel. Every accusation had roots in reality. Every exposed secret was actually secret. Every wound he opened was already there, just covered over with scar tissue and good intentions. He was forcing them to see themselves clearly, and they hated him for it. So they hunted him. Loki ran, first as a man, then as a salmon, then as a shadow, then as wind. He hid in mountains, in rivers, in the spaces between thoughts. He built himself a house with doors facing all 4 directions, ready to flee in any direction danger came from. But the gods were patient now in their anger. They had learned focus from their grief. They tracked him like wolves tracking wounded prey, following the scent of his fear across all the realms. They caught him, finally, in the form of a salmon, trapped him in nets woven from his own children's sinews, for even his offspring turned against him when the gods offered them immortality in exchange for betrayal. They bound him to a rock with chains made from the entrails of his son Vali, who had been transformed into a wolf and forced to kill his brother Nari. Above Loki's face they suspended a serpent that dripped burning venom, drop by drop, into his eyes. Only Sigyn, his wife, stayed faithful. She sat beside him with a bowl, catching the poison before it could fall. But when the bowl filled, she had to turn away to empty it, and in those moments the venom burned Loki's face, and he writhed in such agony that the earth itself shook. "There he will lie," Odin declared, "until Ragnarök." But Odin, who had traded an eye for wisdom, surely knew what his own words meant. He was not just pronouncing Loki's imprisonment. He was setting the timer for the world's ending. For Loki would not lie there forever. The chains would break. The serpent would die. The prisoner would go free. And when he did, he would remember every drop of venom, every moment of betrayal, every year of loneliness. He would rise up, not as the trickster god who had sometimes saved them, but as the enemy who had nothing left to lose. The gods had created their own nemesis. Chapter 7. The Wolves That Eat Light. Time passed differently after Loki's binding. The seasons felt uncertain of their order. Winter lingered too long. Summer arrived exhausted and departed early. The sun seemed dimmer, as if it were running down like a clockwork toy in need of winding. Children born in those years grew up looking over their shoulders, without knowing why. Animals gathered in strange formations, as if listening for a signal only they could hear. The very air tasted of approaching storm, and in the sky, barely visible during the day but growing bolder at night, 2 wolves ran their eternal chase. Skull, whose name meant treachery, pursued the sun with jaws that dripped darkness. Every day he gained a little ground. Every sunset found him closer to his prey. Hati, whose name meant hatred, chased the moon with eyes that burned like dying stars. Every night he ran a little faster. Every dawn found the moon a little more ragged at the edges. The Norse knew these wolves from their older stories, children of Fenrir, bred for the specific purpose of devouring light. But they had always been distant threats, dangers for some far-off tomorrow. Now tomorrow was starting to feel like today. The first sign of Fimbul winter came not as snow, but as a change in the way people looked at each other. Neighbors became suspicious. Friends became rivals. Families discovered they were strangers, sharing the same roof. Brother lifted hand against brother. Father stood against son. Mother turned away from daughter. The bonds that held society together began to fray like rope left too long in salt water. Then came the snow. Snow in summer. Snow in spring. Snow that fell upward from the ground and sideways from clear skies. Snow that had forgotten how to melt, that built upon itself in layers like years of accumulated grievances. 3 years without summer. 3 years without harvest, 3 years without hope. The wolves in the forests grew bold, coming into villages not for food, but as if they were searching for something or someone. The ravens gathered in flocks so vast they blackened the sky, cawing prophecies in languages older than human speech. And in the deep places, things began to stir, ancient grudges, old hungers, promises of revenge that had been sleeping like seeds in winter ground, waiting for the right season to bloom. On the last night of the last winter of the old world, Shul finally caught the sun in his jaws. For the first time since creation, daylight ended not in sunset, but in a scream of light being devoured. In the sudden darkness, Hati seized the moon, and silver light died with a sound like ice breaking. The stars went out one by one, as if some cosmic hand were snuffing candles, and in the absolute darkness that followed, chains began to break. Chapter 8. The Breaking of Bonds. In the darkness deeper than any darkness had ever been, Loki opened his eyes. The serpent above him had died when the stars went out. Even venom needs light to maintain its potency. The chains that had held him for centuries of torment cracked like ice in spring flood. He rose, stretching muscles that had forgotten movement, and his laugh echoed across all the 9 realms. It was not the laugh of the trickster god who had once saved the Aesir with clever words. This was the laughter of someone who had been given centuries to think about what he would do when he got free. On his island prison, Fenrir felt his father's freedom like a key turning in a lock. The ribbon Gleipnir, woven from impossible things, discovered that impossibility itself was just another thing that could be broken if you had enough patience and pain to fuel the breaking. The wolf stood for the first time in ages, and his howl shattered the silence that had followed the death of light. It was a howl that said, "Remember me. Remember your betrayal. Remember your fear. I remember everything." In the ocean depths, Jörmungandr uncoiled for the first time in centuries. His movement sent tsunamis racing across every shore, waves that carried not just water, but the taste of endings, the salt of a world preparing to drown. The world serpent lifted his head above the waves, and his eyes were like green stars in the starless sky. His tongue flicked out, tasting the air, and found it sweet with the flavor of approaching apocalypse. From the shores of the dead, a ship began to move. Naglfar, the ship of nails built from the fingernails and toenails of the dishonored dead. It had been under construction for centuries, waiting for the night when there would be passengers to carry. Loki took his place at its helm, and the dead rose from their graves to serve as crew. Not Hel's honorable dead, but the others, the oath-breakers, the murderers, the ones who had chosen cruelty when kindness was possible. They came shambling from their barrows, eager for one last chance to spread the corruption that had defined their lives. In the south, Surtur's fires began to burn brighter. The fire giant, who had waited since the beginning of time for the signal to begin the ending, raised his flaming sword and began his march north. Behind him came the sons of Muspel, creatures of pure flame who sang as they marched, not battle songs, but funeral dirges for the world they were about to cremate. And from the east came the giants, not the civilized giants who had made treaties with the gods, but the old ones, the wild ones, the ones who remembered when frost was the only law and strength was the only virtue. They came with ice in their beards and hatred in their hearts, ready to reclaim the world from those who had built walls to keep them out. The armies of ending were assembled. The board was set. The final game was about to begin. Chapter 9. Vigrid, the Field of Final Things. Vigrid means the plain where lightning strikes. It was a battlefield that had been waiting since the world's foundation for the war that would end all wars, a stage set for the final performance of gods and giants, heroes and monsters. 100 leagues long, 100 leagues wide, space enough for all the grievances of creation to work themselves out in blood and fire and the settling of ancient scores. From Asgard came the Aesir, marching in formation behind Odin's banner. The Allfather rode Sleipnir, his 8-legged steed, who could gallop across the surface of water and through the branches of trees. In his hand he bore Gungnir, the spear that never missed its mark, though today marks would be harder to choose than ever before. Behind him rode Thor in his chariot pulled by the goats Tangrisnir and Tangjoster, teeth barer and teeth grinder, who could be slaughtered for food and resurrect themselves the next morning. Though after today, there might not be any more mornings for resurrection. Freyr came too, but he rode sadly, for he had traded away his sword for love years ago, and now faced the final battle armed with only a stag's antler. Love, it seemed, was a luxury he couldn't afford when the world was ending. Tyr came, his one hand gripping a sword forged from necessity and regret. Heimdall came, his eyes that could see to the edge of the world finally finding something worth watching. Vidar came, wearing the thick boot he had been preparing his entire existence, the boot that would matter when all other weapons failed. From the other direction came chaos given form. Loki led his ship crew of dishonored dead, his eyes bright with the madness of justified revenge. Behind him prowled Fenrir, grown huge beyond imagining, his jaws gaping wide enough to swallow the sky. And indeed drool from his mouth had become the river that now separated earth from heaven. Jormungandr had dragged himself onto land, and his coils covered mountains, his passage turning rivers to poison. With every breath, he exhaled venom clouds that killed plants a mile away. Surtur came from the south, with his flaming sword, and where his feet touched earth, flowers burst into flame before they could wilt. His fire demons spread out behind him like a wildfire with intelligence and malice. The armies met in the center of Vigrid as the dead sun should have been reaching its zenith. Odin, father of gods, rode straight at Fenrir, the wolf he had helped to feed as a pup. Gungnir, the unerring, met jaws that had learned to bite through anything. For a moment that lasted forever, the Allfather's wisdom grappled with primal hunger. Then Fenrir's jaws closed, and Odin the Far Wanderer wandered no more, but Vidar, the silent god, whose thick boot had been built from every scrap of leather discarded by shoemakers throughout history, stepped forward. He placed his foot on Fenrir's lower jaw, gripped the upper jaw with his hands, and tore the wolf's mouth apart. The sound it made was like mountains breaking. Thor met Jormungandr as they had always been destined to meet. Hammer against venom, thunder against tsunami. Mjolnir found its mark, crushing the world serpent's skull, but with his dying breath, Jormungandr exhaled a cloud of poison so potent that Thor staggered 9 steps before falling dead, his last words lost in the thunder that followed his hammer's final blow. Tyr and Garm, the hound that guarded Hell's gates, fought with the desperate fury of creatures who had been bred for this moment. They slew each other simultaneously, Tyr's sword piercing the great hound's heart, just as Garm's teeth found the god's throat. Freya, weaponless, faced Surtur with only a stag's antler for a sword. The battle was brief and tragic, the god of fertility and peace learning too late that sometimes love's sacrifices cost more than love itself. And Heimdall, watchman of the gods, whose horn had called everyone to this final battle, met Loki at the center of the field, the god of vigilance against the god of chaos, the sentry against the infiltrator, the one who saw everything against the one who was never what he seemed. They had been circling each other for centuries, these two, Heimdall with his perfect sight, Loki with his perfect deception. Now, finally, they could settle the question of whether truth or lies would have the final word. They struck each other down together, Heimdall's sword piercing Loki's heart, just as Loki's blade found the space between the watchmen's ribs. They died, looking into each other's eyes, and what they saw there, hatred or understanding, vindication or regret, died with them. Then Surtur raised his flaming sword high above his head, and the blade grew until it touched the sky. With one terrible swing, he brought it down, and the fire that had been waiting since the beginning of time was finally set free. The flames raced across Vigrid, consuming the bodies of gods and giants alike. They spread to Yggdrasil, the world tree, and its ancient bark caught fire like paper. The great ash that had held all the worlds in its branches became a torch that lit the cosmos. The fire spread to the halls of Asgard, melting gold and turning crystal to steam. It spread to Midgard, boiling the seas and turning mountains to glass. It spread to all the 9 worlds, leaving nothing but ash and memory. And then silence. The silence that follows the last word of the last story ever told. Chapter 10. The Green Dawn. But listen, do you hear that? In the silence after the ending, there's another sound, soft at first, barely more than imagination, but growing stronger. It's the sound of water, not the boiling seas of Ragnarök, but gentle rain falling on rich earth. The fire has burned itself out, and from its ashes, something impossible is happening. The earth is rising again. Green shoots push through the ash, not struggling, not fighting, but simply growing because growing is what life does. Grass carpets the fields where gods fell. Flowers bloom in the footprints of giants. Trees stretch toward a sky that has remembered how to be blue. From the ruins of Yggdrasil, new branches grow. The world tree was burned but not destroyed. Its roots ran too deep. Its connection to the wells of wisdom and fate too strong to be severed by mere fire. It puts forth fresh leaves that whisper new stories to the wind. And from a hidden grove, where 2 mortals had sheltered from the flames, Lif and Lifthrasir, Life and Lifeyearner, stepped forth into the dawn of the new world. They had hidden in the wood of Yggdrasil, sustained by morning dew in the tree's own life force, waiting for the fire to pass. Now they stand in a world made fresh, breathing air that has never known smoke, looking up at a sky where a new sun, daughter of the old, begins her first journey across the heavens. Her light is gentler than her mother's, but no less warm, no less willing to nurture the green things that reach toward her. But the most miraculous thing is this. Death, it turns out, is not always final. Not even for gods. From Helheim comes Baldr, no longer pale with death, but radiant with resurrection. His brother Herder walks beside him. The blind god who had been tricked into killing the light now sees clearly in this new dawn. Their quarrel died with the old world. Their love was reborn with the new. Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, who survived the final battle, stand ready to guide this fresh creation with wisdom learned from their father's mistakes. Thor's sons, Magni and Modis, strength and courage, lift their father's hammer from the ashes of Vigrid. It is lighter now, somehow, still powerful, but no longer heavy with the weight of old grudges and ancient fears. And so the wheel turns. Ending becomes beginning. Winter becomes spring. Death becomes the seed of new life. This was the Norse understanding, not that good would triumph over evil, but that everything, even the gods themselves, was part of a cycle larger than any single story. The twilight of the gods was not defeat, but transformation, not failure, but the necessary clearing away of the old, to make room for the new.